The Ethiopian Bible is the oldest Bible, which is full in terms of a Genesis to Revelation copy, is 14th century.
This is a rare Ethiopian Orthodox Bible manuscript, handwritten in Ethiopia's sacred liturgical language, Ge'ez.
In early 2026, filmmaker Mel Gibson publicly stated that the Ethiopian Bible contains details about Jesus that Western Christianity has, for centuries, failed to. What Gibson said was measured, but the weight behind it was undeniable. That somewhere in the mountains of Africa, locked inside manuscripts more than 15 centuries old, there is a version of the story of Jesus that most of the Western world has never been told. The man who spent 12 years and over $30 million of his own money making The Passion of the Christ, who insisted on filming in Aramaic and Latin for the sake of raw historical accuracy, has now turned his attention to a Bible that is older, broader, and fundamentally different from the one sitting in your church pew. And what it says about Jesus is not what you were taught. The Ethiopian Bible, 81 books. Some accounts say 84. Others say 88. What every scholar agrees on is this: it contains texts that vanished from the Western world over 1,000 years ago. Texts the New Testament writers themselves quoted directly. Texts that illuminate the theological landscape Jesus actually walked through, not the sanitized, council-approved version delivered to you centuries later.
Another aspect of the Ethiopian church that is very famous and often over-sensationalized is their biblical canon. So, the Bible, as we all know, is a collection of many different books. It's not a single book, it's a collection of many different books.
But this is not a simple story about a bigger Bible. The deeper you go, the more uncomfortable the questions become. Because the real issue isn't just which books were included, it's why certain books were excluded, and by whom. That discovery was only the beginning. What came next changes everything. To understand why Gibson's words landed so hard, you need to understand what the Ethiopian Bible actually is. And to do that, you need to travel back in time, not to Rome, not to Jerusalem, but to a kingdom in northeastern Africa that most Western history books barely mention: the Kingdom of Axum, present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. By the 4th century AD, Axum was one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. It controlled trade routes linking the Roman Empire to India. Its kings struck coins. Its monuments rivaled anything in Egypt. And in approximately 330 AD, something happened that would shape the rest of this story. The king of Axum, Ezana, converted to Christianity. That makes Ethiopia one of the first Christian nations in history, predating the Roman Empire's official adoption of the faith. This matters enormously, because Ethiopia's Christianity did not grow out of Rome. It did not pass through the medieval papacy. It did not get filtered through the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, when bishops from across the empire gathered to debate which texts were authoritative and which were not. Ethiopian Christianity developed along its own independent branch, rooted in early African and Jewish traditions, preserving texts that the Roman Church would later set aside. The result is a biblical canon unlike anything else on earth. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest continuously operating Christian bodies in the world, uses a Bible that includes the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the 3 books of Maccabean, the Ascension of Isaiah, and dozens of other texts that simply do not exist in the Protestant or Catholic traditions. Some of these books were lost to the Western world for over a millennium, not hidden, not destroyed, just forgotten, because no one in Europe had access to them anymore, and no one was looking in the Ethiopian highlands. Dr. Judith Mackenzie of Oxford University, one of the leading scholars on Ethiopian Christian manuscripts, has described the textual tradition preserved in Ethiopia as representing a direct window into early Christian thought that has no parallel anywhere else in the world. These are not forgeries or fabrications. They are ancient, they are legitimate, and they have been there all along. But the crown jewel of Ethiopian manuscript tradition, the object that more than any other tells the true story of this preservation, sits in a monastery on a clifftop east of the city of Adwa in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia. And what happened there in November of 2020 tells you everything you need to know about how seriously these monks take their sacred charge. Father Gebretsadek heard the war coming. The conflict that would tear through Tigray for the next 2 years had reached the foothills. And his first instinct was not to flee. It was to protect the books. Under the cover of darkness, this tall, slight monk in long black robes descended the monastery's winding stone steps, carrying the leather cases, thick brown hide stitched by hand, that contained the Garima Gospels. For the first time in recorded history, the manuscripts left the monastery grounds. He carried them into the mountains. He kept them safe. What the Garima Gospels are is almost beyond comprehension. Radiocarbon dating conducted at Oxford University places their creation between 330 and 650 AD. That means these illuminated manuscripts, painted with vivid depictions of the four evangelists, filled with intricate peacock arches and stylized birds native to the Ethiopian highlands, may be the oldest surviving illustrated Christian documents in the entire world. Older than any gospel book in Europe, older than the Rabula Codex in Florence, which dates to 586 AD and was previously considered the earliest. Written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Aksumite kingdom, on vellum pages that have survived invasions, fires, and a civil war. These are not relics of a minor tradition. These are the founding artifacts of a Christian civilization that was thriving while most of Europe was still in the Dark Ages. And they were sitting in a hilltop monastery tended by a handful of monks, largely unknown to the Western world, until now. For decades, scholars knew these manuscripts existed. Most assumed they were no more than 900 years old. Then, the radiocarbon results came back, and even the research team had to take a moment. The initial findings confirmed what nobody expected, but the second round of analysis told a completely different story. The first thing you need to understand is that the Book of Enoch is not a fringe document. It is not a forgery, and it is not new. Scholars estimate it was composed between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD, written first in Aramaic and Hebrew, then translated into Greek, and finally preserved in full only in the Ge'ez language of Ethiopia. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, copied and preserved by the Essene community, a Jewish sect that existed in the same time and place as John the Baptist and Jesus of Nazareth. Multiple copies, not one, multiple, which tells you the Book of Enoch wasn't a curiosity. It was required reading. And then there is this fact, which no serious scholar disputes. The New Testament quotes it directly. The Epistle of Jude, chapter 1, verses 14 and 15 reads, "Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied, Behold, the Lord is coming with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all." That is not an allusion. That is a citation. A New Testament writer looked at the Book of Enoch and treated it as prophetic scripture. Tertullian, one of the most important theologians of the early church, writing around 200 AD, argued that the Jews had rejected the Book of Enoch precisely because it contained prophecies about Jesus. Clement of Alexandria quoted it. Athenagoras cited it. The early Christian world did not consider this book dangerous or heretical. It was authoritative. So why did it disappear from the Western Bible? The answer is not clean, and it is not comfortable. As the Roman Church consolidated authority over Christian doctrine through the 3rd and 4th centuries, the boundaries of acceptable scripture tightened. Texts that were deemed too ambiguous, too apocalyptic, too difficult to control within an emerging institutional framework were gradually deprioritized. The process was not a single decision made in a single room. It was a slow accumulation of councils, synods, and theological disputes over decades. By the time the Western canon was effectively settled, the Book of Enoch had slipped through the cracks, but not in Ethiopia, because Ethiopia was not part of that conversation. If you're finding this as fascinating as we do, alike genuinely helps us keep investigating these mysteries. One tap means the world. Here is where it gets theologically significant. The Book of Enoch contains an entire section, chapters 37 through 71, known as the Parables of Enoch, or the Similitudes, devoted to a figure called the Son of Man, a pre-existent cosmic being who sits on a throne of glory beside the Ancient of Days, who judges the nations, who was chosen before the stars were made. The language is extraordinary, and it is almost word for word the language Jesus used to describe himself. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is repeatedly called the Son of Man. In Mark 14:62, on trial before the high priest, Jesus says directly, "You will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." The high priest tears his robes. He calls it blasphemy. Why? Because anyone familiar with Enochic literature, and the Essenes, the Pharisees, the scribes of Jerusalem almost certainly were, would have understood immediately what Jesus was claiming. He was not using a humble metaphor. He was invoking a specific, already existing theology of a divine cosmic judge, a theology that lived in the Book of Enoch. Scholar George W. E. Nicholsburg, who published a landmark 2-volume commentary on 1st Enoch, argues that the Son of Man figure in the parables represents one of the most significant precedents for understanding early Christology, how the first Christians understood who Jesus was and what his identity meant in cosmic terms. That scholarship is not fringe. It is published by Fortress Press. It is taught in seminaries. It is simply not reaching Sunday morning congregations. This is the detail that keeps researchers up at night. That Jesus may have been drawing on a specific text, one preserved entirely in Ethiopia, when he described himself to the people who would eventually kill him for it. Take a moment with that, because the implications are quiet but enormous. If the Book of Enoch shaped the way Jesus spoke about his own identity, then removing it from the Western canon didn't just trim the Bible, it removed the key. It removed the interpretive framework that makes certain things Jesus said fully intelligible in their original historical context. You're left with the words, but not the world they came from. This is where conventional scholarship tends to push back. And the pushback is fair. Most academic historians are careful to note that we cannot prove Jesus read the Book of Enoch specifically. We can only establish that the Enochic tradition was alive, active, and circulating in the Jewish world he inhabited. The Essene community at Qumran, who many scholars believe had significant contact with John the Baptist, and possibly with Jesus himself, treated the Book of Enoch as among their most sacred texts. Influence doesn't require a receipts trail, it requires proximity, and the proximity is undeniable. There is also a second objection worth taking seriously. The Ethiopian canon's unique books do not, strictly speaking, offer a secret alternative biography of Jesus. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, remain central to Ethiopian Christianity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is not a heterodox sect. It is one of the oldest, most theologically sophisticated Christian bodies in the world. It affirms the resurrection, the divinity of Christ, the apostolic tradition. What it adds is context, depth, a theological architecture that makes the Jesus of the Gospels legible in ways that Western traditions, by narrowing the canon, inadvertently obscured. Seen from a distance, the difference looks like a footnote. Up close, it is an earthquake. Now consider the Book of Jubilees, also preserved uniquely in the Ethiopian tradition, also found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, also read by the community that produced John the Baptist. Jubilees retells Genesis and Exodus with intense emphasis on time, on sacred calendars, on appointed seasons, on a cosmic schedule underlying human history. It describes a world ordered by divine cycles, invisible to those who don't know how to read them. Why does that matter? Because Jesus' entire ministry is structured around time, around appointed hours, around festivals and seasons and moments that feel, in the Gospel of John especially, charged with a weight that the narrative itself doesn't fully explain. My hour has not yet come. That phrase appears again and again. And when his hour finally does come, it arrives at Passover, a festival whose deeper cosmic dimensions are mapped in extraordinary detail in the Book of Jubilees. Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, one of the leading Dead Sea Scrolls scholars in the world, has argued that Jubilees must be treated as essential background reading for anyone who wants to understand the world of Jesus. Not because it changes the gospel story, because it illuminates the framework within which that story was originally told and heard. And that framework is right there in the Ethiopian Bible. It has been right there for 1,500 years. The first result was surprising. The second was unsettling. The third changes everything. Here is what the Garima Gospels themselves reveal, not as a theological document, but as a physical artifact. In 2013, a two-day academic conference was held at the Ioannou Center for Classical and Byzantine Studies at Oxford, sponsored by the Ethiopian Heritage Fund. The title was precise and deliberate: Ethiopia and the Mediterranean World in Late Antiquity, the Garima Gospels in Context. Scholars of manuscript history, iconography, paleography, and early Christian art gathered to grapple with what radiocarbon dating had established: that these manuscripts from a cliff-top Ethiopian monastery were not medieval curiosities. They were ancient artifacts from the heart of early Christendom. Jacques Mercier, one of the leading experts on the manuscript's artwork, presented findings that stunned the room. The scored grid lines underlying the illustrations and text demonstrated something remarkable: that both the illuminations and the Ge'ez script were produced in the same workshop at the same time in the Kingdom of Aksum. This was not a text imported from elsewhere and illustrated later. This was an indigenous Ethiopian Christian artistic tradition, fully formed, producing what may be the world's earliest surviving Christian images, at a time when much of Europe had barely begun to organize itself theologically. The portraits of the four evangelists in the Garima Gospels, Matthew, Luke, John, and a profile of Mark seated on the episcopal throne of Alexandria, became the template for a visual language that spread across Christendom. The wide-eyed frontality, the vivid border patterns, the deliberate hierarchy of sacred space, all of it developed in Ethiopia, in Ge'ez, in a monastery that no woman was permitted to enter, tended by monks who believed these books were alive. A manuscript is something that is alive, said Maria Malara, a scholar who studied the Garima community directly. It is not a dead piece of text. It is a living thing. The monks believe the Gospels were written by Abba Garima himself, one of the 9 saints who brought monasticism to Ethiopia in the 5th and 6th centuries. According to tradition, God stopped the sun from setting so that Garima could complete the work in a single day. The monks don't treat this as a metaphor, they treat it as fact. And when Father Gebert Sadik carried those leather cases down the stone steps into the Tigrayan night, he was not carrying ancient artifacts, he was carrying a living saint. The data was clear, the implications were anything but. Now step back from the manuscripts, step back from the parables of Enoch and the Son of Man theology and the sacred calendars of Jubilees, and ask a different question. What does it mean that all of this existed? All of this ancient, authenticated, academically verified biblical tradition, and the Western world spent 15 centuries largely unaware of it. Some scholars frame this as a simple story about geography and communication. Ethiopia was isolated. The manuscripts couldn't travel. Scholars couldn't access the monastery. It wasn't suppression, it was distance. And that framing is legitimate and largely accurate. But other scholars, a smaller, more controversial group, argue that the story is more uncomfortable than that. They point to the pattern of canon formation itself. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD did not simply adjudicate theological disputes between competing doctrines. It consolidated authority. It determined, under the supervision of a Roman emperor, which version of Christian identity would be normalized and which would be marginalized. texts that complicated that process, texts that portrayed a Jesus steeped in Jewish apocalypticism, a cosmic judge with pre-existent divine status, a figure whose very vocabulary was drawn from a tradition the institutionalizing church wanted to move beyond, found themselves deprioritized. One controversial theory goes further. It suggests that certain texts were not merely deprioritized, but actively discouraged, not because they were false, but because they were politically inconvenient. A Christianity rooted in the Book of Enoch's cosmology is inherently harder to institutionalize. It is more mystical, more apocalyptic, less amenable to hierarchical governance. The Roman Church needed a Jesus who could anchor a civilization. The Enochic Jesus, the Son of Man who descends on clouds of judgment, is harder to manage. If we take the evidence at face value, these are not idle speculations. The early church fathers who championed the Book of Enoch were systematically overruled. Tertullian, who defended it, was eventually classified as a heretic on other grounds, and his defense of Enoch went with him into theological exile. The book that Jude quoted in the New Testament was quietly placed beyond the boundary. Ethiopia simply never received that memo. Other scholars cautioned strongly against this framing. Dr. Christopher Tuckett of Oxford, a leading New Testament scholar, has argued that canon formation was genuinely complex and that attributing it primarily to political conspiracy flattens a nuanced historical process. Different communities, different criteria, different moments in time. There was no single Roman conspiracy. There was a gradual narrowing, shaped by institutional pressures, yes, but also by genuine theological discernment. Both things can be true. The narrowing can have been partly political and partly theological. The result is the same either way: a Western Christianity that lost the interpretive key to its own founding texts. What if these are not two stories, an Ethiopian story and a Western story, but one story, fragmented across geography, that is only now becoming visible in its entirety? There is something that lingers when you sit with all of this, something that the facts alone don't fully capture. Generations of monks in a hilltop monastery in northern Ethiopia copied these texts by hand through invasions and famines and fires. They called them sacred relics. They would not let women enter the gates. They believed the pages were alive. And when war came to their door, the first thing a monk thought to protect was a leather case containing words written 15 centuries ago. On the other side of the world, Mel Gibson, a man who had already made one of the most controversial films in the history of Christian cinema, looked at those same texts and said, quietly, that they contained incredible detail about Jesus that the Western world refuses to discuss. Neither of these men is a conspiracy theorist. Both of them are responding to something real: the recognition that the story handed to Western Christianity is not the whole story. That somewhere between the Council of Nicaea and the printing press, and 500 years of Protestant theology, something was left behind. And it has been sitting in the Ethiopian highlands all along, covered in painted birds and illuminated angels, wrapped in thick brown leather, waiting. The monks of Abba Garima don't call this hidden, they call it preserved. And perhaps that is the more accurate word, not suppressed, waiting. The distinction matters. So here is where we land. The Ethiopian Bible is real. Its antiquity is verified by Oxford radiocarbon dating, confirmed by 2 independent analyses, and documented in peer-reviewed scholarship from the University of Notre Dame, the Ioannou Center at Oxford, and the Ethiopian Heritage Fund. These are not fringe institutions. These are the people who set the standards by which ancient texts are evaluated. The Book of Enoch is real. Its presence in the Dead Sea Scrolls is documented. Its citation in the New Testament is undeniable. Its direct influence on the theological vocabulary Jesus used to describe himself is a subject of serious, ongoing academic debate, not among YouTube commentators, but in the pages of the Journal of Biblical Literature and the Hermania commentary series. The Garima Gospels are real. They may be the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts on Earth. They have been guarded by monks for 15 centuries. They were hidden from a civil war in the middle of the night. They are currently still in that monastery in the mountains east of Adwa, tending to themselves in the dark. And Mel Gibson's interest in all of this is not difficult to understand. He spent over a decade obsessing over the historical reality of the crucifixion. He filmed in dead languages. He paid $30 million of his own money because he believed the sanitized Western version of the story wasn't telling the truth with sufficient force. Of course, he looked at the Ethiopian Bible. Anyone who truly wants to understand who Jesus was, not the icon, not the theology, but the man who walked through the villages of Galilee speaking in a language shaped by the Book of Enoch, would have to. The question isn't whether this material exists. It does. The question is what you do with it. We have been asking questions like this for as long as we have been human. The question of what was kept and what was lost. The question of who gets to decide which version of the truth gets told. The question of whether the institutions we inherited did right by the tradition they claimed to protect. The Ethiopian monks who carried those manuscripts into the mountains during a war were not asking abstract questions. They were answering a very concrete one, and their answer was, some things are worth any cost to preserve. The Garima Gospels survived the 9th century. They survived the 16th century, when Muslim invaders likely overran the monastery. They survived 1930, when fire destroyed the main church. They survived 2020, when the most devastating conflict in Ethiopia's modern history swept through Tigray. Each time, someone decided they were worth protecting. Each time, a pair of hands reached for that leather case. There is a line in the Book of Enoch, preserved in Ge'ez, copied by monks, studied now by scholars, cited once in a letter that made it into your Bible, that describes the moment the righteous finally understand what has been hidden from them. It says simply, "And in those days a change will occur for the holy and chosen." Scholars debate what Enoch meant by that. They debate when it was written, what historical moment it was responding to, what its author intended by those words. They debate with rigor and care, and the way that people who love a thing debate it. But you don't need a seminary degree to feel the weight of it. A change will occur for the holy and chosen in those days. Here is the question that nobody can answer for you. Not Gibson, not the Oxford scholars, not the monks of Abba Garima, and not this channel. If a 1500-year-old manuscript tradition, preserved by a civilization the Western world forgot to pay attention to, turns out to contain a deeper picture of the Jesus we thought we knew, what does that mean for everything we decided we already understood?